Episode 1. An Introduction. Hello. I don't know how to start this, so I thought I'd just start it and see how it goes. I'm Lisa. My name is Lisa Brooks. I'm making these because I felt that I had to. Recently, I've been receiving letters, a lot of letters, which would be lovely if I knew any of the people who have written to me. At first I thought that some of them were mistakenly sent to the wrong address, but they are clearly intended for me. I've received about 10 of these letters so far, and they seem to be from different people. I was going to go to the post office and return them, but they all seem to write to me specifically, using my name. Some of the letters appear to be so old that they're falling apart. I thought I should make some recordings, as I don't think I can keep these. The box I've put them in keeps giving me a bad feeling. So here is the first one I ever received. It's strange, to say the least, especially as I've never met Sandra, and I've never even been to South Wales. Sandra writes, Lisa, it's been a while, but I wanted to speak to you. I've been needing to reach you about something rather urgently. My family takes a trip every year to South Wales to go camping. This year, we ran into something life-changing. We usually took our holiday in the summer, but our family had been scattered around the world working. It was October when we were all back in the UK. We all agreed that an autumn camping trip would do just the same. Myself, Mark, Jeremy and his spouse, Carol, drove down to the small village we've been going to for generations. Carl and Angela were already there when we arrived. Being the eldest of the brothers, Carl had wanted to seem in charge from the moment we got out of the car. He slapped Mark and Jeremy roughly on their backs, grinning smugly as he pulled them both into a tight hugs. The way only a ripped yet insecure man can. Mark and I shared a look. We knew he was going to be a pain for the entire holiday. As we unpacked the gear, Carl took over the conversation, spouting off about his new job in Italy, his new car that, for some reason, he couldn't pick any of us up in. Jeremy followed behind me. He started already, he whispered to me. We giggled, only stopping when Angela moved past us to carry the new tent Carl was banging on about. Angela was Carl's new wife. She's lovely. I mean, we didn't know much about her before the trip, as all of us siblings had just got drunk at their wedding, which seems pretty harsh to us, but Carl was rich and Angela was his third wife. We felt we may as well get a booze-filled evening out of it. As we plodded off in the direction of the usual field, we felt the first drops of water. We all groaned, knowing that rain was going to make it far worse for us. Wishing I was tucked up in bed, I pushed past Carl, leading everyone into the field faster, hoping that we got everything up before the storm opened up completely. We didn't. With the tent set up and everyone and everything drenched, we headed to the pub. The locals scoffed at us, clearly unimpressed by our mudded appearance. Jeremy and Carol drank cranberry juice, which Carl felt was ridiculous, and the rest of us had ciders. Huddled in the warmth of the booth, we began to dry up. So, I think we've all heard what Carl's been up to. What's been going on with everyone else? Mark said, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Carl seemed offended, but held his hands up, leaning back as if he wasn't affected by it. Well, Jeremy started before looking to Carol for approval to continue. She nodded, giving him a small smile. Carol and I have been, well, because it's more her than me doing the work. Carol has decided to try for a child. Everyone but Carl erupted into congratulations and celebratory noises. What's the baby's gender? Carl asked, as if anyone cared. Angela sighed in annoyance, clearly used to this behaviour. What the fuck, Carl? Mark said, ready to suggest we make Carl go back to the campsite. I'm just asking. Wanted to know before I suggested baby names, Carl said weakly, as if anyone believed him. That's amazing, Carol. Are you any far along? I asked, hoping I wasn't being insulting either. 10 weeks, Carol said, smiling weakly. Again the table erupted in uplifting noises of cheer. There was an enormously loud thud from somewhere up the valley. We were all confused till we saw the crack of lightning in the distance. A small elderly lady in the corner noticed our reaction to the loud noise. She laughed at us, sipping her small Guinness. She looked like she was about to turn away from us when she turned towards us and leaned closer to us. They say that during storms like this, the giants walk the earth. She spoke through mottled teeth at us. Giants? Carl asked, clearly ready to move off the baby topic. They've lived here for centuries, hiding in the caverns and lakes. They walk about in the thunderstorms because the noises hide their loud steps, she continued. We all stared at her. She seemed almost like something out of a movie. Oh, how interesting. Well, have a good evening, Mark said quickly, hoping to end this odd interaction. It was clear, however, that the old lady was not finished. Committee full. She lives just up the mountain. She is not one to be trifled with, so keep yourselves from there, she said before getting up and taking her Guinness with her to the other side of the pub. Well, that was weird, Carl said, stating the obvious. We should probably head back to the tent soon, I think. The rain is letting up. Best if we're tucked up tight before the rain comes back. Don't want to be thrown out into the rain at closing time, Jeremy said, always the worrier. We finished our ciders and trudged out, politely waving to the old lady as we left. She smiled back, turning to look back up at the mountains out of the window. The storm was calm until we got back to our field, when it came back down again in swathes. Climbing into the tents, as mudded as when we had set them up, we tried to get some sleep. I was sharing a tent with Carol, and we stayed up chatting. It was nice until we heard a loud commotion outside. Unzipping the front, I saw nothing. It was too dark. But I felt the ground rumble. It rumbled like a heartbeat, on and off, like footsteps, but more regimented and huge. There was the sound of someone running in the dark towards the tent. Carol and I shivered, trying to work out where the running was coming from. Suddenly, something thwacked into the back of our tent at full speed. It slowly found its way round to the front. We sighed in relief as Jeremy came into view. What is it, Jer? Why are you out in this? Carol asked, clearly exhausted. Something, I don't know. Broke our tent. Mark. Jeremy tried, speaking in between wheezing gasps for air. Mark barreled into him out of nowhere. Both of them seemed bewildered. Being too tired and it being too early to deal with this shit, we let them sleep in the tent with us. In the morning, Angela woke us up at 7, offering us some breakfast she'd been preparing since 6. In the light, we could see that the boys' tent had been knocked over. There was what appeared to be the front half of a giant footprint on one side of it, as though someone had tiptoed over it. Carl had apparently been immediately excited by this, storming off to the village to harass the poor locals. Angela had been less excited. She seemed worried and suggested that perhaps we ask the farmer whose field it was if he had a more sheltered field closer to the village we could stay in. Mark and Jeremy were trying to get us all to take pictures in the footprint when Carl returned. He seemed annoyed, and sleepily trailing behind him was the farmer who owned the field. The farmer was still in his pyjamas, a big coat being the only thing keeping him warm in the chilly morning air. He seemed shocked by the print, and worried. He told us that if we left before the next night, he'd pay us back our camping fee, and he'd give us some free eggs. We'd taken so long to get here that most of us were reluctant to leave. Carol suggested that it was a prank, believing that maybe the elderly lady had got some younger village members to do this. With this idea in place, everyone relaxed somewhat, believing that the danger was non-existent. The farmer seemed less sure. He told us that we should probably leave and that he didn't normally let people stay in the fields past the summer. Carl handed him a £50 note, thinking that the farmer was pressing us for cash. The farmer took it but glared at him. "For your women's sake, take off and not return until the warm seasons," he said, before trudging back from where he came from. "What do you think he meant by that?" "What do you think he meant by that?" Carol said, fear seeping back into her voice somewhat. "He's probably just threatening us so that we don't blame him if some local teenagers rob us," Carl said, tucking into bacon and eggs. Something inside me felt that the locals weren't going to attack tourists, especially if they'd just pranked them. Why? After breakfast, we went for our traditional hike. Usually we went down the valley towards the town to grab some sweets from the sweet shop and have afternoon tea. However, Carl was insistent we try going up the mountain. "Town? We always go there. Why don't you guys do something exciting for once?" Carl argued, tempting fate with every word he said. We tried to take his mind off it, but Mark was quite excited about the idea of a harder trail to take. We eventually all agreed to go up the mountain, but only after downloading a map from the internet of a route. The route was steep and far tougher than we had previously expected. Mark and Carl raced ahead competitively. The rest of us trailed behind, and we stopped every now and then for Carol. At one point, we lost sight of Mark and Carl as they disappeared over a ridge. Angela seemed a lot calmer with Carl out of range. Jeremy watched Carol's every step carefully so that she didn't fall or twist her ankle. We were taking a rest when we heard a scream far ahead of us. It sounded a bit like Carl. Back when we were kids, he used to scream when he saw insects. Angela and I raced ahead, trying to catch up to the others and find out what was going on. As we clambered higher and higher, we heard Mark join in the screams. As we approached, there was a sound of metal clanking, and from nowhere, we were surrounded by Celtic warriors. A large man grabbed Angela from behind, holding a small woven knife to her neck. I screamed out before I was also grabbed and dragged with Angela towards a large cave. "Jeremy, run!" I yelled down the mountain. "Get Carol away!" I heard Angela shout, also sending out a warning. As we were dragged to the cave, I desperately tried to communicate with the Celts. "Please let us go." "Parlez français? Hablez espagnol? Loquer is Latin?" They responded to none of it, except the Latin. Upon hearing the Latin, They became angry, tossing me to the floor. From the floor, I could see Mark and Carl stood back to back, tied together, both sobbing and sweating. I slowly got up, hoping that this wouldn't incur my being thrown down again. Angela was glad to see Carl as she sighed in relief at the sight of them. However, she wasn't relief for long. Mark and Carl were suddenly raised off the ground by a huge hand that had appeared from the darkened shadows. We watched in horror as they were raised high into the air. An enormous, gnarled, mossy face appeared from the shadows. It looked closely at them, sniffing them, before opening its gaping maw, supposedly to throw them in there. "No!" Angela and I yelled. There was a scream from outside. Carol was brought dragging and kicking into the cave. Realising how terrible the situation was, I began throwing stones at the giant. I hit Carl a few times, but the others got the idea and threw in the direction of the gigantic being. The giant turned to see us and lowered the men back to the ground. Leaning out of the shadows, it pointed a finger at us. It poked me with its index finger. It felt like being rugby tackled. I was pushed down again. Coming face to face with the floor again, I was knocked unconscious. When I came to again, I saw Mark. His face was covered in blood, and he was trying to carry me out of the cave. Jeremy was sobbing along with Angela. They were all trying to get me out of the cave. I had no idea what was happening. I was too out of it to question it. I didn't see Carol or Carl. We were out of the cave and making our way down the mountain when we were nearly hit by a large leg. Looking up, there was a large being, so large, he could have been a small giant. He bent down to stare at us. "Oi, oi, T," he said, slowly, his voice booming down the mountain. "Who are you?" I asked, not quite aware of the strange situation. "English?" He seemed confused by this, but at least he understood us. "Have you met my wife?" he asked, seemingly worried, which for a man so big was perplexing. Does she live in that cave?" Mark said shakily, gesturing back to the cave. The giant nodded. He noted our blood-covered appearances and sighed, causing all the trees to sway. He dropped the items he was carrying to pick us up, taking us back to the cave. "Please, sir, please don't take us back," Jeremy said through sobs. "Don't worry, I'll fix this. She was probably just hungry. She gets that way. She's pregnant, you know," he said, almost conversationally. "Congratulations," I said, granting glares from the rest of the humans. Upon entering the cave again, I could see the place was littered with bodies of the Celtic warriors. The others must have fought them. Carl and Carol were lying still among them. I felt suddenly ill. The giant lay us down before approaching his wife. She seemed to be busy giving birth. She strained before letting out the loudest scream I have ever heard. It rippled out of the cave and down the mountain. Must have been heard in the town. a fully formed grown woman clad in traditional leather Celtic armour slithered from her legs. The small giant approached his wife, seeming to calm her down. They embraced before beginning to apparently argue in Celtic. Irish, I think. She seemed to come round to his point of view, smiling at him before groaning and pushing another warrior from her groins. She picked up one of the dead warriors, popping it into her mouth, chewing loudly. The small giant returned to us smiling. "Sorry about that. She gets in a mood if I don't bring her the sheep she likes. I think these two are yours," he said, picking up Carol and Carl. "Yes," Angela said sadly. "2 ticks," the enormous man said, taking the 2 lifeless bodies over to the giant cauldron and dropping them in. There was about 30 seconds when we had no clue whether this was a good or bad thing. Then he stirred it before pulling Carol out of the cauldron, dropping her in front of us. She was covered in slick slime, and she was cleaned up of cuts and blood. Coughing, she spat out slime, wiping it from her face. "Hello," Jeremy said when she stopped coughing. She smiled back at him happily. "What happened?" she asked. "We don't know, to be honest," Mark responded. "We still don't," Angela said, eyeing the cauldron. The large man stirred again and scooped Carl out. "I think this one might be slightly overdone. Sorry." Carl coughed, spluttering like Carol. "What does that mean?" Angela said tensely. We soon found out. Carl cleared his throat, moving his mouth, but no sound came out. Carl had lost his voice. "I'm sorry about your friends. Here, take this." The man handed Mark an enormous pot of strange substance. He waved at us, and we left. We made our way down the mountain, feeling very confused and tired. We left the morning after. That was some months ago now. We reported this all to the local police, but they thought we must have got high off mountain berries. We've tried to get groups together to re-find the cave, but haven't had anything from it. The mysterious substance turned out to be a really good sourdough starter. We think it could be incredibly old. And Carol's given birth to twins, which is odd because they only saw one child on the scan initially. She's named them Rhys and Meredith, 2 Welsh names, possibly because she narrowly escaped death there. They are both very healthy, if a bit larger than for normal babies. Carl hasn't regained his voice, but Angela says he is a much better listener. We got away from Comedy safely, but I worry for those who might not. What should I do? I was going to ask you next time I saw you, but that might not be for some time now. Love you lots, Sandra. I've looked for a Sandra in stories surrounding South Wales and supernatural elements. However, I can't get very far without a surname. All of these letters seem to only use first names. I wish I could respond, to ask questions, to find out what connects me to them. Why are they reaching me? They seem to indicate unnatural activity and call on me for help. I don't know why. I've never taken an interest in ghosts or conspiracy theories. I've always found horror films unrealistic and detest jump scares. Perhaps if I read them all, note down little details, I can piece together an answer to my questions.